It begins with a sound, a single sharp tone slicing through the subterranean hum inside a mountain. The noise was banal enough to an outsider, a metallic ping among the clicks and beeps of consoles, but to the men and women at those stations, it was the sound that could change everything. In Cheyenne Mountain, the green screens glowed in dim rooms, paper cups cooled beside ashtrays. Watch officers watched radar sweeps as if every green blip were a heartbeat. Their job was terrible in its simplicity: detect incoming missiles and warn the nation in time to respond. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, in time meant minutes, often only a few minutes between an alert and a decision that might unravel the fragile order of deterrence and, in the worst case, end civilization as known. Over 3 nights between 1979 and 1983, November 9, 1979, June 3, 1980, and September 26, 1983, false warnings moved through the machinery of Cold War defense. Each incident had its own technical origin: a training tape mistakenly fed into live systems, a 46-cent microchip that began producing phantom data, and a satellite system that misread reflections high above the Earth. Each produced the same terrifying possibility: that systems designed to prevent war might accidentally bring it about. Between those technical failures, human judgment repeatedly acted as the final filter. Hesitation, skepticism, the awkward and lonely decision to doubt the machine, these small, unglamorous acts kept catastrophe at bay. This is the story of those nights, the systems that failed, the people who hesitated, and the incremental reforms that followed. It is a story about fragility, how increasing technical sophistication can shorten the time available to decide, and how human doubt, not automation, remained the uncelebrated failsafe. The world had not always been organized around the minute. For decades after 1945, nuclear strategy evolved under the logic of deterrence. The central idea was brutally simple: if two sides could credibly destroy each other, neither would risk starting a conflict. But credibility required systems, missiles, bombers, submarines, that could survive a first strike and deliver retaliation. It required warning systems that could detect an attack in time to respond. And over time, doctrines changed to emphasize speed. Launch on warning, the posture of acting on indications of an incoming strike rather than waiting for impact, offered the theoretical advantage of preserving the retaliatory punch. But it came with a cost. It compressed decision windows and put enormous weight on early detection infrastructure, whether ground radar, satellite sensors, or computer networks that fed them. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union spiked in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, NATO deployments in Europe, and the renewed arms rhetoric of the early Reagan years all increased mutual suspicion.
The Strategic Defense Initiative's announcement and rapid technological changes added a layer of urgency. Policymakers and commanders believed that speed and precision were increasingly paramount. At the same time, the sensor and command networks that underwrote warning were still immature by modern standards, brittle, sometimes poorly tested, and dependent on human operators trained to act quickly under stress. The first of the 3 false alarms occurred on the night of November 9, 1979. A training exercise that had been designed to test domestic procedures and response plans found itself inside the live detection network. Somewhere in the chain, a simulated tape that played out dozens of inbound missiles was loaded into a system feeding NORAD's consoles. Overnight, computers in Cheyenne Mountain lit up with phantom tracks, hundreds of missiles apparently launched from the Soviet Union toward the United States. At 3 a.m., the National Military Command Center in Washington began to populate with reports. The president's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, later recalled being awakened and told that multiple missile impacts were detected. For a moment, he and others believed they might be facing a real strike. Messages were dispatched. The Strategic Air Command in Omaha and submarine commanders were alerted. The nerve center of American deterrence shifted from quiet to urgent. As panic partially took its hold, technicians and analysts scrambled to verify the readings. A paper trail and later reconstructions show a flurry of phone calls, cross-checks, and growing confusion. The early warning displays were not simply confirming one another. Many of the simulated signatures mirrored the tape's pattern because the tape had been transmitted into the live feed. The simulated launches, designed to be recognized inside a closed test environment, accidentally rode the pipeline into operations. Minutes stretched like hours. The realization that a training tape had been fed into the live system did not arrive instantly. It required technicians to trace the source, to uncover a sequence of procedural lapses that allowed a test input to escape its sandbox. When officials finally understood what had happened, they recognized how narrowly the system had avoided escalation. The incident exposed a fragile architecture, interleaved testing and operations, insufficient isolation of simulations from live feeds, and a doctrine that presumed near-perfect data. Brzezinski's later recollections and subsequent declassified accounts framed the night as a near miss without descending into dramamella. Historians have been careful to emphasize the systemic factors rather than heroic single actions. Still, for those awake that night, the terror felt immediate and total.
The remedy was immediate and procedural: stricter separation of exercises and live operations, new safeguards to prevent training inputs from propagating into operational channels, and renewed attention to cross-checking. The lesson was blunt. You cannot assume every signal is real, and you must design systems so that simulated noise cannot masquerade as the real thing. Less than a year later, on June 3, 1980, the machines again looked mistaken. This time, the culprit was smaller and cheaper than a training cassette, a malfunctioning microchip, a mere 46 cents in retail value. A tiny defect in a circuit caused displays to infer multiple incoming targets, creating phantom missile tracks that populated air defense consoles. Strategic Air Command crews in Omaha moved from alert to action. Pilots were prepared for launch. B-52 crews went to their aircraft. The gears of retaliation edged closer to turning. The scare that evening was not theatrical. It was a sequence of banal failures stacking together. A faulty component fed bad data to a system that assumed a certain level of hardware reliability. Operating procedures required human confirmation from independent sources before a nuclear launch, but the false data propagated quickly enough to threaten to slip through the verification net. Officers on duty worked through checklists, attempted independent radar confirmation, and initiated cross-communications with other centers. At each stop, human judgment and insistence on physical radar confirmation, not blindly following a computer readout, pushed the system back from the brink. Accounts from officers present that night repeatedly stress how ordinary their work felt: long hours, routine checks, the monotony punctuated by moments of acute stress. One common recollection among veterans was the cognitive shock of suddenly having to make sense of instruments that seemed to insist the sky was falling, when outwardly there was no evidence. The story of the 46-cent chip is a reminder of how minute failures, a solder flaw, a tiny particle causing a short, can cascade upward in systems designed to trust their inputs. The two American incidents reveal similar themes: complexity breeds fragility, and systems that shorten decision time amplify the consequences of error. They also show a more counterintuitive truth: as detection grew more sensitive, people had less time to think. The technological promise of faster warnings became the operational problem of forcing human beings to decide in ever shorter windows. Across the Iron Curtain, a different false alarm arrived with the dawn on September 26, 1983, and its resolution rested squarely on human judgment. Early that morning, at a Soviet satellite early warning station south of Moscow, the OCO system reported inbound missiles launched from the United States. The console lit up, warning lights indicated multiple launches.
At the Soviet command centers, calculations suggested that seconds, not minutes, remained to decide whether to retaliate. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was serving as the duty officer at the command post when the alarm sounded. The system reported a small number of missile launches detected by satellite sensors. According to his later accounts and those of other officers, Petrov found the pattern did not fit what he expected of a real American first strike. He reasoned that if the United States were to launch a first strike, it would be massive and unmistakable, not a handful of missiles. The data came from a single line of sensor reporting. Radar confirmation was not yet available. Against procedure, and with immense personal risk should he later prove wrong, Petrov judged the alert to be false and did not pass it on as a confirmed attack requiring retaliation. In the years that followed, Petrov's decision would be celebrated by some historians and commentators as a moment of crucial restraint. Yet even celebratory accounts are careful to add nuance. Petrov did not single-handedly end the Cold War or stop an inevitable Armageddon. He made a judgment call under uncertainty, one that luck and institutional structure also helped preserve.
The satellite system at that moment was susceptible to false readings, reflections off high-altitude clouds, or misinterpreted sunlight glinting from cloud tops, and these physical effects, combined with software interpretations, produced the spurious alert. Petrov's choice to interpret the pattern skeptically was decisive in that instance, but the incident also exposed structural risks that had little to do with individual heroism. Petrov later lived in relative obscurity for years. He was neither court-martialed nor publicly lionized during his life. Only decades later did his choice receive wider attention. The symmetry between Petrov's hesitation and the American near misses is striking. Both sides, even when operating different hardware and doctrines, relied ultimately on human beings to interpret ambiguous signals. Both systems were vulnerable to mundane failures, tape mix-ups, cheap chip defects, odd reflections in the upper atmosphere. After the 1979 and 1980 incidents, and with the moral clarity cast by Petrov's episode, military institutions and governments turned from panic to process. They pursued reforms that in aggregate aimed to widen the decision window and reduce the chance that a single faulty input could precipitate irreversible action. Several themes emerge in the reforms that followed. First, simulation and testing were separated from live operations. The 1979 tape fiasco had shown how easily an exercise could leak into a live feed. Isolating training inputs, the so-called air gap, between test environments and operational networks became a priority.
An air gap is a literal and procedural separation. Training data is kept on systems that are physically or logically disconnected from real sensors, feeding scripts for actual warnings. This is a simple but profound structural change. Make it harder for simulated signals to ride the wires of real alarms. Second, redundancy and independent verification were tightened. Where once a single source could trigger escalatory procedures, directives began to require corroboration from multiple, independent sensors before an attack was treated as certain. This principle, do not act on a single source, was formalized in guidance that emphasized verification from distinct systems, satellites plus ground radar, for example. In 1984, policy changes codified higher standards for confirmation and clearer chains of command. One notable step in that period was a directive often referenced in public accounts by its shorthand, ND 119, issued in 1984, which reinforced requirements for verification from multiple sources before certain classes of response would proceed. These measures did not eliminate the need for timely decisions, but they did shift the burden away from raw automation and toward a more deliberative process, even under time pressure. Third, human training and culture were reframed. Officers were taught to tolerate uncertainty, to view alarms with a degree of professional skepticism, and to insist on cross-checks. The institutional memory of those near misses, the nights when ordinary hardware and ordinary decisions nearly cascaded into cascation, became a teacher. Stand by, wait. The three words, a quiet tradition among watch officers, captured the moral been there. Pause, confirm, then act. Hesitation, once seen as indecision, gained value as moral and practical prudence. Technically, reforms also addressed specific vulnerabilities. Software was scrutinized more thoroughly, hardware procurement standards were tightened, procedures for logging and tracing data flows were strengthened. The idea was not to eliminate possibility of error, which is both impossible and unwise to promise, but to increase the number of independent hurdles a spurious alarm would have to knock down before it could trigger irreversible moves. The stories of those nights illuminate a stubborn paradox of deterrence. Deterrence requires survivable forces and credible indications that a response will follow an attack. Yet the more finely tuned and automated the detection and response systems become in pursuit of credibility, the narrower the margin for human judgment. Faster sensors and automated feeds can compress the timeline so severely that the people remaining in the loop must either make instant choices or be bypassed entirely by automatic launch protocols. That trade-off between speed and human judgment sat at the heart of policy debates for decades and remains central today.
There is a psychological and moral dimension to this paradox that cannot be measured in lines of code or radar ranges. Operators, watch officers, technicians, the people who worked nights in rooms of green screens, lived with the pressure of being both small and consequential. Many veterans speak of the peculiar loneliness of the role, long stretches of routine punctuated by moments when their judgment mattered more than any rank, when a misread signal could escalate beyond their ability to correct. Some took early retirement, some suffered stress and anxiety. The burden of being the final human filter in a machine of retaliation left marks. Institutional cultures sought to share responsibility through cross-checks and redundancy, but at the end of the chain, there was always a person making a call. When historians and analysts today look back at these near misses, they do so with a mixture of admiration for the restraint shown and caution about how close the world came to catastrophe. Most of the time, that trust was warranted. Sometimes it was not. Between the inputs and irreversible outputs, there was human judgment. Looking back from our present, it is tempting to reach for larger narratives about moral heroes, about last-minute saves, about inevitability. Those temptations should be resisted. The Knights of 1979, 1980, and 1983 are not grand morality plays with simple protagonists and tidy lessons. They are, instead, case studies in the fragility of complex systems and the quiet, mundane acts that kept catastrophe from unfolding. They tell us that systems matter, that how we structure training, simulation, verification, and procurement shapes outcomes, and that human judgment matters too, in ways planners often find inconvenient to model. We should also be cautious about transferring those lessons as literal warnings about modern systems without qualification. New technologies, machine learning, networked sensors, faster weapons present novel challenges. But the historical record invites measured reflection, not alarmism. The appropriate response is prudence. Embed independent verification, preserve human judgment in critical loops, and resist incentives that reward speed at the expense of certainty. There are policy details to consider beyond slogans. Institutional reforms like the air gap principle and directives that require corroboration from multiple independent sources are concrete steps. So is continued investment in human training that emphasizes skepticism as a professional virtue. Internationally, confidence-building measures and crisis communication channels can reduce the probability that ambiguous incidents will be interpreted as hostile acts. History suggests such measures matter, not because they can eliminate error, but because they lower the probability that error will cascade into catastrophe. The 3 episodes also reveal something about how we remember near misses. Petrov's choice became a symbol decades later. The 46-cent chip is retold as a parable about how tiny things can have oversized effects. The 1979 tape exposed procedural laxity lurking in the machinery of national security. Memory tends to simplify. Real history resists such easy narratives. Each scare was both unique and emblematic, a particular failure revealing systemic frailties. As the narrative draws toward its close, return to that first sound, a single, sharp tone in a dim room of green screens. Imagine the small, ordinary gestures that intervened. A watch officer taking an extra moment to ask for corroboration, a technician tracing a signal back through a web of tape and wiring, a lieutenant colonel trusting a pattern of doubt over a blinking light. These acts were not celestial, dramatic, or guaranteed to succeed. They were, however, the quiet practices that tilted history away from the abyss on more than one occasion. There is no moral facile enough to satisfy the appetite for heroes or villains in these stories.
The real lesson is less cinematic, but arguably more important. Hesitation, trained and institutionalized, can be one of humanity's greatest safeguards. In systems that have the power to end civilization, we should be designing architectures that require people to pause, verify, and be compelled to ask hard questions before irreversible actions proceed. Sources and documents that trace these incidents are available in archival materials, official debriefs, and later interviews with participants. For those who want to dig deeper, the specific dates are worth starting points: November 9, 1979, June 3, 1980, and September 26, 1983. Sites referenced in the declassified records include NORAD's operations in Cheyenne Mountain, Strategic Air Command centers in Omaha, and Soviet satellite early warning stations south of Moscow. Some names and details are straightforward in the records. Zbigniew Brzezinski and General William Odom appear in later accounts and analyses, while other references in various retellings may require verification against primary documents. For example, some sources list a Colonel William Sutter. That name appears in multiple accounts, but should be checked against official rosters. If this story resonates, if the thought that a tape, a chip, and a choice nearly unmade could have had global consequences catches you, consider following the archival path. Official reports, contemporaneous news coverage, declassified memos, later interviews with officials and officers. Those records are the best way to understand not only what happened, but why it continues to matter. History does not offer easy guarantees. It does, however, provide lessons shaped by error and close calls. The late 20th century near misses under the weight of nuclear deterrence taught one central lesson: that the moral act of pausing, the small refusal to let a single automated signal override human prudence, can be the most consequential decision a person makes. In an age when technology only accelerates, that ethic is worth preserving. If you want more deep dives into the near misses of history, subscribe. The machine was, in the end, a mirror, precise up to the limits of its design, blind to context and vulnerable to the same banal failures that affect all human creations.
Against the glow of screens and the clatter of circuits, people learn to mistrust certainty and to prize hesitation. Those lessons are quiet, not cinematic. They are found in new procedures and in the reticent memory of officers who once kept their hands off buttons that might have launched a chain no one could stop. The final image returns to that sound in the dark, the metallic tone inside a mountain, an officer looking at a blinking console, and the three words, "Stand by. Wait," that more often than any code or cable kept the world from crossing the line between warning and war.
Sources and archival documents are linked in the description. If this account offered a new way to think about those nights, like and subscribe for more history that matters.